there's a just a little concept that I continue to wrestle with as far as the trying to put all this stuff in some kind of linear model is obviously a difficult thing to do, and putting it in this structure of body work, subtle work, mental, emotional work, imaginal work.
Yeah.
I go back and forth between should it go from body to subtle to mental, or should it go from body to mental to subtle? And
Oh, that's a good question.
yeah, because it's an important thing to kind of dive into as far as really how it all works, because there's an interplay between these different levels. And if I walk up and grab your arm, that's a body level, gross physical level occurrence that then you're going to have a subtle level reaction to, right? And so you could certainly say that, well, the subtle energetic thing that's going on in Jeff right now is the cause point was on the gross level. But then at the same time, you can say, well, actually Jeff's subtle energy field was affected as Lance grabbed his arm. You know what I mean? It gets to be this kind of chicken or the egg.
I do, and I think that it's a good point, though, because your mental reaction is what you notice before
Right.
you notice a subtle energy reaction. Or like before you, or like it's your mental perception of it, or how you register it reads as mental to that invasion.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get at a lot last time, was how it reads, how it registers. We live our lives by that information these days to such a large degree, to a problematic degree. Just the mental readout in our mind. So that whole idea that we've lost touch with ourselves, our bodies, nature, the direct moment. We're just, and it's that analogy that I don't think is coincidental, that, it's like there's been these shifts away from the present moment to, sort of the fall into time, as Ken Wilber puts it, was a huge shift, to where we orient in time in a way that isn't the only option, and the idea that as children, we, at a certain age, we have not oriented our minds to the passage of time yet. And we all experience this, obviously, daily. An hour goes by, and sometimes an hour seems like a super long time, and sometimes it's short. And that's a result of the state we were in during that hour, and how it registered with us, right? With regard to memory of it, and with regard to how long or short the time seemed. And these different states and these different orientations that we go in and out of in our mind is what it comes back to for me, and it's why I call it the dimension approach, because it's about that kind of thing, that time's a dimension. There's other dimensions that are not linear time, and we all go in and out of these dimensions. It's just that we don't track it. We don't talk about it that way. We don't take it into account as much as I think we could, in order to improve in awakening, healing, growth, and performance aspects. And so paying attention to the readout, the mental readout, the thoughts, the concepts, the ideas, the narratives. This was the big shift, sort of the postmodern intellectuals presented that idea that language and thought and concepts and paradigms are not absolutes. They're these relative constructs that don't have ontological existence, and that's a really important insight, an important thing to take into account. It can be taken too far, and there can be destructuring that is excessive. It of course depends on how you apply this stuff always, but that idea that, okay, our mental readout, we have access to experience that's beyond what's going on in our minds. And so what I was starting to say is there's been these huge shifts, right, where the fall into time. And so then we used to be sort of, free of time, so to speak. Our minds kind of set these parameters, and now we largely orient to time. If you work Monday through Friday during the week, you're in time in a certain way that on the weekend, by Sunday afternoon, you've kind of shifted and you're in more of a nonlinear time mode, and it feels different. And then you start to sense, oh shit, here comes Monday morning. I gotta adjust and go back into this different mode where I'm more operating within the parameters of tracking linear time. And we made another huge shift just in the last 30, 40 years where, we used to track to the physical world. Now we largely track to the digital world. Not only sitting in our desks looking at a computer screen versus talking to humans, but walking around looking at our iPhones. It's intense the way we've done that. And of course, a shift prior to that was with the advent of the printing press. Humans started spending a lot of time having their experience be oriented to written words on paper. These shifts are important to kind of take note of, and because the idea is you're in a certain mode. For example, while you're looking at a computer, you're literally doing a different thing in your mind and in your energy field. You're orienting in a particular way. Of course, conceptually, we all know, well, of course, let's say the little video I'm watching on my computer and the people or the characters involved in the thing I'm looking at, of course, they're not real. They're different than what's going on right around me in the physical world. But we go into a mode in our nervous system, in our mind, in what portion of our brain are we orienting from when we lift our gaze from the computer and now go to actually interact with a live human in present time. We just kind of assume that we've completely shifted modes now, and now we're orienting, to this person. And there's ways that we haven't. There's ways that we're deriving identity. There's ways that we are anchoring our attention. There are lenses that we were using to watch the computer that now we're using that same lens to interact with an actual human or to interact with our own selves. And we don't realize it. It's analogous to, you have sunglasses on because you're outside, and you just kind of forget that you're wearing sunglasses, and then you go inside, and you can have that experience where you forget that you still have your sunglasses on. You just think it's dark in the room. Maybe you turn the lights on brighter, and it's like, oh yeah, or you could take your sunglasses off because you forget that you're still looking through those lenses. These different lenses that we look through, we largely just do it without thinking about it. Just like the fascial tissue thing, just like the tensegrity thing, it's there. We're operating from it, but we don't sort of track it the way that we, I think, ideally could. And the subtle energy conversation, the same thing applies. It's we're all experiencing subtle energy. We're reacting to it. We're responding to it. It's influencing us. We're having subtle energetic interactions, but most people aren't looking at specifically the subtle energetic interaction. Their mind is registering the thoughts, for example, that are a result of the subtle energetic interaction. And then they're thinking the thoughts are causative, or the feelings are causative, or are primary. And what I'm suggesting, and this is in line with the overall psychoanalytic view, and of course all kinds of ancient wisdom traditions, is that the thoughts are actually secondary. The thoughts are symptomatic. The feelings are symptomatic of this energetic exchange that's going on. There's far more leverage, there's far more ability to create change in feelings and thoughts when you work directly with the energy versus just trying to affect change within the thoughts and feelings realm.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the fact that we can say something and someone can hear something else, or a
Right.
stranger you've never met could talk to you and say something, if you just wrote it down, would be totally innocuous, but there's some feeling it creates in you that leaves you feeling distressed or angry or confused. But all they could have said is, do you know where the grocery carts are?
Right.
And that there's all these things going on that we know about. And then we'll feel that in retrospect, like, oh, maybe I just was like off that day. It's like, or maybe that person was weird. Like we
Yeah.
don't, there's no validation for these subtle realm feelings that cause these mental emotional reactions. So all we have to wrangle in the meantime are these thoughts and feelings we have that we can't explain.
Totally.
Something else that you made me think about, that because you're talking about this subtle field and then it causes these mental emotional reactions, that there's a latency there. So in audio, like when everything was analog before digital, there was very little latency because each component in the process was just doing what it did. So there was like time, but like with sound, it was pretty limited amount of time. When now it's being processed digitally, there's more time between when you try to do something and when the reaction happens. So these mental emotional feelings, there's a latency between the subtle energy disruption or activity and when you feel something about it, and then even more time before you think something about it. So earlier you're talking about the distance we create between us and the current moment is a physical time distance between what's happening on another level of experience. So to continue the metaphor even further, you talk about the amount of time we spend on the internet or on our phones, and then bringing that kind of perception to human, person to person, like conversation. Like if we're bringing that lens of the computer to that, we're bringing so many different layers of latency back to a conversation that we're bringing our mental emotional reactions to subtle feelings we had about reading something someone wrote on the internet that was the result of mental emotional reactions they had to something. So there are so many layers between what you might read and what was written and how that person was when they were written. So that person and that experience is totally different than the person or experience you may talk to later after seeing that online. Like you are so disconnected from what actually happened because of all those layers of latency.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really important point. Like you're saying, the texting, for example, to the actual intent, the actual tone, the actual meaning doesn't necessarily come through in a text. You can be standing there in person with someone having an interaction, but there can be that same, or there is that same kind of latency that if you're not, let me say it this way, you can be standing there in person with someone, but you can have defenses and filters going on in you, and you do, that are creating latency, even though they wouldn't have to, right? And so that's a lot of what growth, healing, therapy is about, is like, okay, there's a miscommunication or a lack of communication or a lack of connection between these two people. And it's often not that they are necessarily just diametrically opposed in some way. It's that there's all these filters and defenses that are distorting the actual intentions, the actual thoughts, the actual feelings that each has for each other. And so they're getting inaccurate messages. And it's just a shit show. And the field of psychotherapy is one, field where you're really trying to dive into that and get a sense of, of what's the unconscious thing going on. What's the unconscious motivation? What's the unconscious feeling? What's the unconscious thought? And not just unconscious from one person to the other, but of course it gets even more complex when you consider that within the individual person, they're only conscious of a certain amount of their own motivations.
Totally. So I think that's a good follow-up topic. So with a client, you're having to distinguish their subtle energy reactions from their mental emotional reactions and their patterns around those. So they may react to you in a certain way that they have a mental explanation for the emotional feeling they have that's a reaction to a subtle energy change. So how do you navigate those differences, or how do you distinguish those? So that's one, just personally, how do you do that? And then how do you try to explain that to someone, those kind of stages? How do you differentiate those dimensions?
Yeah, that's a good question. My quick answer is intuitively.
It's God-given.
And of course, and I mean that it's largely intuitive. And when you kind of are operating in that way all day, every day at work, you get better at it. But if I try to, give a more complete answer, explanation to that, intentionally differentiating the three is the first step, right? Like in the same way that it's like, okay, the kind of your standard thing that happens with psychotherapy is that, there's the, and how do you feel about that? And then the person answers that question, and then the therapist says, okay, that's a thought, but what's the feeling you're having? The person's like, well, my wife is, doing this and that. It's like, okay, and how do you feel about that? Well, I just think that she should do it this way. And it's like, okay, that's a thought. What's the feeling that comes up in you when your wife is doing X, and then the guy gives 87 different thoughts he has about it. And it can be hard to get a person to even within themselves go into what am I actually feeling versus what are just more thoughts I'm having that are responses and adaptations to the feeling that I'm trying to get away from or trying to change, but I'm refusing to directly acknowledge or experience the actual feeling itself. So that kind of distinction, and then it's like I'm adding the subtle energetic experience. So a lot of times with clients, it's the same kind of thing where I'm asking them, okay, if they do have some subtle energetic, some ability to sense and distinguish subtle energetics from emotions, from thought, then we just talk about them separate. Here's what I feel like the energy is doing. Here's what I'm feeling. Here's what I'm thinking. And then I will also chime in of here's what's going on in me as I sit and talk with you about this, or here's what I'm sensing in you, et cetera. They might say what they're sensing in me, and we try to distinguish this stuff, and that's another way of answering your question, is that it's just a way of framing the conversation that lends itself to discerning these things, and it's often a different way of of approaching it that, then the client is used to, and often the client really appreciates it because it lends itself to insight that wasn't there when they were simply focusing on feelings or when they were simply focusing on thoughts.
What's the shift in? So I would say it's like progress to distinguish these things because you begin to get closer to current time. If we're going to talk about latency, we're going to talk about the moment, talk about living, like being present. It's like removing these layers of separation from that. So the mental, the emotional, and the subtle layer. So how does that track over time? Like as you're able to, or like what changes as you're able to distinguish those things?
It depends on what the goal is, right? Which again is why I try to distinguish. Is someone coming to me for performance work? Are we trying to heal a wound? Are we trying to facilitate growth of some kind within the psyche? Are we trying to facilitate more of a conscious awakening experience? And in all of those, there's these common threads that I'm always talking about. But it's also important to distinguish them. And so the word I use is there's these different modes that we can go into, meaning the words I tend to use are orienting, anchoring, and identifying. I'm always talking with my clients about those three words. And so if the word attention, this is why Jeff and I are creating an audio glossary, because all these words have, I'm using them in a certain way, and they're obviously words that get used in thousands of different ways. So it's important to distinguish what I'm trying to say here. So the word mode, the word dimension, the word orienting, the word anchoring, the word identifying, and the word attention. Those are all words that I think are important to get a sense of. So if attention is just what most people think of it as attention, right? It's just the ability to attend to something. A big part of what I'm always looking at, and a big part of what the dimension approach is about, is okay, but we have this ability to attend from different organs of experience. We can attend, for example, even just within our gross physical senses. It's like, are we listening with our ears? Are we smelling with our nose? Are we feeling something out with our tactile sense? So we have these different organs. And when you get into the subtle energetic realm, as opposed to the gross physical realm, you recognize all these different energy centers in the body are really organs of experience. Your first chakra is an organ, just like an eyeball is, that is a sensory organ that performs a certain kind of function, and it only has access to a certain dimension. Just like your eyes can't hear, right? And your nose can't see stuff. Your first chakra can't do what a third chakra can do. So organs of experience, subtle energetic organs of experience come into play, right? So then it's okay, well, which chakra, for example, are you orienting your attention from? Meaning, which organ are you attending from? And of course, you can attend from stuff other than chakras. So it gets complicated. But if we just say, okay, orienting, anchoring, and identifying, where are you orienting from is huge, because it's absolutely important. If you're going to try to see something, you can't use your nose. Anchoring is huge. We could do a whole podcast on anchoring, and hopefully will, because our attention needs to anchor somewhere. It has to anchor on a context, anchor on a field, anchor on an object, anchor on a concept. We got to anchor somewhere. Otherwise, it's just chaos. It's just psychotic. It's just disorganized insanity. So anchoring is super important. And then identifying is another huge topic, because what's always important in any experience is not only where you're orienting from, it's not only how your attention is anchoring, but it's what is self right now. What is the subject? Who is the subject? What is the subject? If you don't have a subject, again, it's just insanity. And we operate in our lives orienting, anchoring, and identifying via our patterns, via our conditioning. But we have the ability, and this was this huge change for me. We have the ability to stop and turn around and look at, wait a minute, where am I orienting from right now? We have the ability to do that. We have the ability to look at, where am I orienting from? Where am I anchoring? What is self right now? It's huge. I know I keep saying the same thing, but it's like this is a massive game changer. Doing what I just described, again, is what the dimension approach is about. It was a huge change in my life. And so, in answer to your question, what changes? Where you're orienting from, where you're anchoring, and what is identity? Those three things change.
I was just thinking about an example of that shift, because I think the way I think about it or describe it is that we have different ways of being ourselves, that we see ourselves as a single thing, and really we're a composite of these processes you're talking about. Really we're a collection of entrenched patterns to reactions we've had in the past, which just sounds silly, but a more like tangible way of kind of seeing it is who you are at work versus who you are at home.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what is my work identity? How do I interact at work? How do I talk to people at work? And then what is my home identity? How do I talk to people at home? And it seems unapproachable in a way, because we think of ourselves as one thing, because in some ways we are. Like we have the same, like we look the same from day to day. We have the same name from day to day. But the way we talk, if we start to notice the way we talk at work versus the way we talk at home, it can be destabilizing to see how different that is.
No doubt. And I mean, I feel like you hit it on the head there with regard to stability. If you ask the question, well, why aren't we, if we have the ability to look at these things and to see or become aware of or become conscious of where we're attending from, where we're anchoring and what identity is, why aren't we doing it? Right? Why isn't that a more common, natural occurrence? And one of the ways to answer that question is because it's destabilizing, as you just said. What's getting destabilized is our identity, because we tend to identify from a certain place in our ego mind. That place is where we tend to orient our attention from. That place is what we consider identity. And to turn around and look back at that, then we're orienting from somewhere that isn't that place. And as we do it, it's decentering. We have this experience of I don't know where I'm looking from right now. Right? If I'm looking at, it's like if you had the experience of suddenly seeing yourself from 10 feet above yourself, like if you had the visual experience of that suddenly, it'd be destabilizing. I'm used to having my visual perception orient, from my eyeballs in a kind of a three-dimensional way at the world. To see your body from above, it would obviously be, a perceptual shift that would be destabilizing. And that's just kind of analogous to one of the things it does when you try to be conscious of yourself in a way that you become aware of a place you were previously only aware from. It's really powerful. It can be really intense. It causes awakening. It causes shifts to do that. As I've said before, it's like if someone's got a knee problem, the crux of their knee problem is that they are stuck orienting their attention from a spot that needs to change. They need to shift and orient from a different spot. But that change doesn't come about easy. Why doesn't it come about easy? Well, it's not only destabilizing. You not only have to find a new place to become aware from that maybe, you don't have much of a sense of yet. But the place that you've been aware of, you clamp down and set up shop from that place. You sort of planted your flag, and now your ego identity orients from that place. You did that for a reason, and the reason tends to be that there was trauma that was too overwhelming to stay consciously oriented and experience and process. So you left consciousness as far as your identity and your place that you tend to orient from. You left consciousness, you split from consciousness, and you posted up in this certain spot in order to put a stop to experiencing the trauma. And the way that works is that consciousness is expansive. And when you come out of that expansive consciousness and you hunker down and post up in that ego stance, it's contractive. The nature of it is that there's a contraction in your mind, in your energy field, that happens when you do that. And the contraction halts the movement of the energy of that traumatic experience. We repress, we split from consciousness, and we contract in the dimension where the experience was too overwhelming. Again, just like on a computer, if you're oriented to the desktop and you have a window open, if the experience in that window, if you have a desire to not be looking at the content of that window, you can close that window or at least minimize it. So we do this in our mind and in our subtle energy field. We close down windows. We close down dimensions. We close down energy centers. We minimize them. We not only minimize them, we may minimize them all the way to now they're just in the dock, or we might even close the whole frickin' file, and put it away. And this just happens. We usually don't decide to do this. And in fact, if it's trauma, we specifically didn't decide to do it. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was an unconscious reaction. So it happens. We close down our mind in a certain way. We seal off this dimensional experience. Sometimes we not only put it away, with certain traumas, especially early on, this idea of core wounding and core issues and core traumas. With those, what we've done is we have not only clamped down on that dimension, but we have set up shop right there and decided I'm going to orient from here. And now my identity is this contraction. And my defense mechanisms, for example, my character defense structure, is going to be all about protecting this spot, protecting this castle. Thus begins false ego life. And then this process of trying to undo that is the process of healing and growth and awakening, which involves a process of going all the way back to finally getting at the original trauma, opening that dimension up, and now processing, healing, coming to terms with the content in that dimension that so long ago you had put away.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.